All right, friends. Oh, camera's on the other side. Welcome to our third evening, Giving Up Bad Theology. Or someone asked me again, what do we mean by bad? It's not judgmental, it means bad, or bad theology means harmful theology. And so, as we explained in the last 2 Mondays specifically, and tonight we will do this again, and I will give you some examples, clear examples, why some of the ideas we have about the devil is harmful, and then why this is a bad theology and we should change it. Oh, can we all sit over here? Laurie, is that okay? For discussion groups later. Yeah. Mary Jane has some corner over there if you want to sit there. Yeah. Okay, glad you're here. Time is up for questions about the last topic, so we need to go on. We have a lot of things to cover tonight, so buckle up. I have 2 announcements before we go into our evening for today. First of all, if you have a question or a comment, Henning has a microphone, and it's not for the understanding in the room, it's more like for the 10 to 15 people watch it online, that they can hear your question. If you feel uncomfortable but still want to ask a question, I will repeat it out loud in the microphone, so the people who are watching at home, give us a moment then, and then you will hear the question or the comment again. The second one is I want to mention for the people at home, and Dale has a video. I'm going to show you how you can access the handouts we hand out here. They are all on our website. So maybe Dale can show us the clip real quick so you know how to access the handout for tonight and the coming evenings as well. So you go to our website, www.cheneyumc.org, and then you go to the section Worship, and click on Lent Series 2026. Then you scroll down on that side, past those information, and then there's a section about handouts. And then you click on the handout for tonight, the devil, and there the handout is. That's also true for you guys here. When you go home, you can do that as well. All right, I hope that helped. Other than that, let's start singing together our first song that brings us into the mood to discuss and talk and think about the devil. Light of the world. Feel free to sing along. Yeah, it starts the light of the world, yeah. No panic, everything is all right. It's the microphone.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Here
altogether worthy, altogether wonderful to me.
Let's start with prayer. Well, let's follow with prayer. Loving God, I want to thank you for this evening, for everybody who took time to think about this interesting, challenging topic. We ask you that you lead us in this conversation, discussion, and listening with the Holy Spirit, that we understand more about evil or about what the Satan is and what we have to do as good Christians in this case. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, friends, before we jump into Hebrew vocabulary and biblical theology, oh, now the microphone is on, I'm sorry. Let's start with something simple. We need to go to Mentimeter, so we need your phones again, as we told the last couple times. Who doesn't have a phone and needs mine? Rodney, do you need a phone? Let's put this on here. And then on the top side, you have to put in the code if you didn't scan it before. So, here, you just fill that out when it comes along. Okay, let's see how many are coming in. And in a moment, Dale will open up the first slide, and then you can choose a picture. Yeah, we see 15, 16 people joined. We have 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18 people here, so that looks good. Yeah, someone is excited for some thumbs up. Okay, I think, is everybody logged in who made it? Who tried to? Wanted to? Okay, cool. Oh, okay, Roger is still going on, okay. Awesome, okay. Let's jump to the first slide. And now you can pick that picture that mostly fits your idea or imagination of the devil. What picture fits most, or mostly, your idea or imagination of the devil? Is it the first one more like this classical, you know, I don't even know the English words for those things he has in his hands. The fire, then we have, is it the devil on your shoulder telling you to do bad things? Is it more like something, I don't know, darkness, evil, abyss, something undefinable? Is it someone like Hitler, more like a human being that is pure evil? Or is it, also from the medieval times, someone that comes into your sleep and gets at you, sort of Martin Luther idea? Or more like lawyers? Or whatever you interpret, that's up to you. Okay, so I see very interesting choices here. I also like this picture of the devil there on number 5, or something with this butt going on there. I don't know what that is, but they were creative in those times. All right, so we see we have a winner, if you want to say so. Hitler, I think we can agree, he was definitely not a good one. All right. I think that was it, right? It was just this slide. Okay, cool. Let's keep this in mind for you, what you think about this. So what we're going to do is, we do the little lecture has 2 parts. One part is Satan in the Old Testament. So we just do a biblical fact check. Where does the Satan show up? How many times? And what does that mean? and then we do a little break discussion group, and then we look into the New Testament. So, first of all, I forgot can you give me the clicker real quick? Let's go to the first slide. Yes, so Satan in the Old Testament, this is the Hebrew word which is pronounced Satan. So it's a little bit different than the English pronunciation. Quick quiz question, and you have it on your handout if you have looked already. But how often does the noun, everybody knows what a noun is? Okay, good. Satan or Satan appear in the Old Testament? Any guesses who has not looked on the handout already? Okay, it's over 20 times. And I listed all the passages on your handout, so let's just test it. If I put on the correct passages here, I think that's a good idea. Because I warn you, the Hebrew word Satan does not always mean what we think it means. So let me show you what I mean by that. The first one is from Numbers 22:20. There it says, God's anger was kindled because he was going, and the angel of the Lord took a stand in the road as his adversary. Now he was riding on a donkey, and his 2 servants were with him. Quiz question. Where is Satan, the Hebrew word, translated? Did you see the word Satan? Adversary? That's a good guess, maybe. Let's look at the second passage, 1 Samuel 29:4. But the commanders of the Philistines were angry with him, and the commanders of the Philistines said to him, Send the man back so that he may return to the place that you have assigned to him. He shall not go down with us to the battle, or else he may become an adversary to us in the battle. He is David, and he is apparently an adversary in the battle. So weird thing, when you read your Bible, then you don't see that there is the Hebrew word Satan. And we have like over 20 times it shows up that way. So what we can learn already is the Hebrew word Satan does not automatically mean the devil or the Satan, the way we imagine him. Actually, that Hebrew word has those kind of meanings. Adversary, accuser, opponent, one who resists. And it goes back to probably, we don't know for sure, to a Hebrew verb that means sort of the same things. Hard to tell where it actually comes from. So, in the 2 examples we just read, one time it is the angel of God that appears as a Satan, an adversary or someone that stands in the way. In some passages it refers to the human political enemies, and it's just the word enemy that shows up here in our translations. Like the one from Samuel, it is David who appears as Satan, adversary or an enemy to the Philistines. So one thing we have to see, the noun Satan doesn't mean this kind of horned, red, devilish thing. It just means, first of all, someone opposing you. So we see something very important. Satan is a role, not a name, in the Hebrew Bible. It becomes clear that nobody speaks of a fallen angel or a God-similar figure that is pure evil. It's used to describe a bad person being in the way or being an enemy, an opponent. A little side note, in the Greek word for devil is diabolos. That's probably where we get the English word devil from somehow, diabolos, and simply means the disruptor or the troublemaker. I'll look at that later in the New Testament. So jetzt now we have though the question, so where does the Satan as sort of a person come from with a name and as an opponent to God? Where is this coming from? Good question. In the Old Testament we receive no information about where a personification of evil comes from. Personification is we take something like evil and give it a figure and make it talk. right? That's a personification. We don't know where this person or this thing comes from. It's all suddenly just shows up. So Satan is mentioned as a person, or let's say an acting figure, only 3 times in the Old Testament. And important is 2 times with an article. So now we get into grammar, and I will explain in a bit why grammar, when we translate things, is very important. There's an article, ha Satan, and 1 time it's mentioned this evil figure that works and does things and talks that just says Satan. So we have 2 times ha Satan, 1 time Satan, and I will tell you what that means. So the first one we find, ha Satan, is in Job, that's how you pronounce it. Job 1 and Job 2. That's the one you probably know, right? You have heard of this story, this bad thing going on, okay? And then in the prophet Zechariah, chapter 3, and then in the book of Chronicles, Satan as an acting evil without an article shows up in Chronicles 21. So the Satan, as most of us know to them today, only shows up 3 times in the Old Testament. 3 times. Did you find that surprising or not? No? Not at all? Okay, well, let's see. And if you look closely and read the years of scholarly theological work, you realize those passages are also one of the youngest and newest ones in the Old Testament. So all the other texts are way older, and Job and the Chronicles and the prophet Zechariah are one of the latest additions to the Old Testament. That's important to know as well. And then there's a difference that the story in Job and the one in Zechariah plays in heaven somehow, and the story in Chronicles plays on earth. So let's look at those passages a little bit closer. So, the book of Job. The first and foremost detailed passage about the Satan. So we believe that's the first time we hear anything about Satan is in Job. And this text is incredibly important because here the Bible sets the theological tracks that remain valid all the way into the New Testament. In other words, the entire Bible stays within the framework that's established here in Job. That's important to remember. And I'll say this honestly, some Christian traditions get into very confusing waters precisely because they miss what this passage is doing, what the role of this Satan figure is. So in the opening chapter, Job is introduced as a faithful and blessed man, family, wealth, livestock, everything. And then suddenly, the scene from Job on earth shifts, and we go into heaven. We move from earth to heaven, and then we see that Bible verse, the children of God came to present themselves before the Lord. So this is sort of described as a heavenly council that comes together, and it's a poetic image of God's court, God's advisors, or let's say God's ministers that come together. It's highly symbolic language. And among them appears then suddenly Ha Satan. So among the children of God is another child of God, Ha Satan. And the article is important. It means the. So the Satan or the Satan. But that little grammatical thing tells us that Satan is not a name. It's the same in English. You don't say, this is the Christian, right? You don't say, this is the Orion. You don't use an article for that. And that's the same in the Hebrew grammar. When there's an article in front of this, it doesn't say, ha David, which would be the David. I mean, there are situations where you just talked about someone and said, by the way, this is the David, right? But that's not the case here. There's nobody talked about him before. So we can see from the grammar that the writers chose that it's not a name. It's also not a title. It is the Satan, the Satan. which again then just actually means the accuser, the adversary, the troublemaker shows up. A translation like the New Revised Standard Version, the one we use in the United Methodist Church mainly, mirrors that. And if you look into the Bible there, it doesn't say Satan. It says also the accuser or the adversary. The King James Bible translated Satan. But newer ones who have this background information say, okay, it's actually irritating if we do this because it's actually not fitting what people believe it says. So they have to change it and use accusator or accuser or opponent or troublemaker, adversary. That means this guy, the troublemaker, is only simply a figure among many standing in God's throne room. And then you have to notice something fascinating if you read that story. The story does not begin with God and Satan met and then they started talking. Instead it begins, one day the children of God came to present themselves before the Lord. Why? And that's very important to understand. Because before Satan ever speaks, the text makes one thing absolutely clear. This all happens in God's presence, in God's domain, in God's throne room. So the author is establishing God's authority first. And that's actually brilliant theology when you think about it. Which gives us a hint and says, you should never talk. Oh, we had this already? Okay. You should never talk about Satan without first making clear who is in charge. God. It's a very specific theological decision that's made here. There's only one ruler in this room, and it's not Satan or the adversary, whatever you call that thing. So before any dialogue begins, the hierarchy is settled, and that's very healthy and very biblical. And then, watch carefully what happens next. God opens the conversation in chapter 2. God asks the questions. Then God sets the limits. And then God ends the conversation. Which tells us again, one figure here holds all the authority. And then there's this problematic figure, the troublemaker, the accuser, but has no power. So what do we do with this biblical fact experience? The first thing is, first major insight about the devil or Satan we find here is, and this is really an important theological insight that doesn't change in the New Testament, is evil is never equal to God. So this is wrong. Because the devil wouldn't even have the chance to try to arm wrestle with God. Has not even the same power at all. God would just like, and the thing is gone. So the adversary has no independent power, has no separate kingdom on his own, and no rival authority. So the book of Job deliberately pushes back against what we call dualism, and I will explain that later a bit more closely. So the book of Job insists God holds the whole world in his hand, and even its tensions and mysteries in divine hands. And then there's a second important thing we can learn from this passage. Satan does not represent a cosmic enemy of God, but a way of thinking. Act, consequence, nexus is what we call it, or act, consequence of theology. Now it gets nerdy, okay? This is a concept or kind of theology that is very important in the Old Testament and still shows up in the New one as well. It means good people prosper, bad people suffer. Right? That's the act-consequence nexus. That's why some people believe when they read the Old Testament, prosperity gospel. If you're good enough Christian, God will bless you and you will get money. Right? Act, consequence, nexus. If you want to be a bit mean, you would say, you're talking like the devil. So this is the concept that is behind it for which the accuser, the Satan figure, stands for. And it was still alive, this kind of thinking, when Jesus walked the earth. We see this in moments when the disciples see a blind man and someone asks, oh, what did he do to be blind? And then they say, hey, he was born blind. What could have he done? Oh, what did his parents do that he was born blind? That is the act-consequence nexus theology, that you do something bad and you have to have this kind of punishment, right? That happens with that. And Jesus breaks through this act-consequence thinking again and says that has nothing to do with each other. And here, Satan is defending that system. And we see the same then in the book of Zechariah, where the other Satan figure shows up, and where Satan, with an article as well, Satan, becomes the accuser of a human and asks for punishment based on the thinking act-consequence. But God disrupts the system here in Job and also in Zechariah. And so the book of Job, for the first time, explodes the simple idea that suffering equals punishment. It dismisses the idea of a connection between suffering and sins or wrongdoing. And that's a theological breakthrough for people.
Would you say that again?
That it dismisses the idea of a connection between suffering and that you have sinned and that's why you're suffering. You see this still today in some Christian circles, right? When they say, oh, Hurricane Katrina hit, it's because of all the sinful people down there. Act-consequence nexus, which is broken through in the book of Job. Because Job didn't do anything wrong. He was faithful, he was good, and still had to suffer, right? There's no connection with him being a sinner or anything like that. So interestingly, also, at the end of Job, in chapter 42:11, it says, or the suffering is actually attributed to the Lord, not to Satan. Then there came to him all his brothers and sisters, to Job, and all who had known him before, and they ate bread with him in his house. They showed him sympathy and comforted him for all the evil that the Lord had brought upon him. I just leave that there. But even here, Satan does not operate independently. He's not God's cosmic rival. He acts within divine permission. And that's already very different from medieval imagery or how people see God and the devil today. All right, let's look one more passage in the Old Testament. Which one? Where was the third one where Satan shows up as a figure? Chronicles, exactly. Last patches, and that's actually the most interesting one because it's a bit of a mind blower. In 2 Samuel 24 and in 1 Chronicles 21, we are told about David's sin. Can you blend that out for a moment, real quick? Can you just go through the camera first for a second? Yeah. So we are told about David's sin in both of those stories because it's the same story, just a little bit of a different writing and a different time. And David's sin consists of wanting to take a census of the people, an action that ultimately leads to disaster and great suffering for Israel. So God doesn't want him to make a census. David does it anyways. Punishment. So in both passages, David does not simply rebel on his own initiative. He is incited to do it. So in 2 Samuel, now we need that passage, we read this following. Again, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he, the Lord, incited David against them, saying, go, count the people of Israel in Judah. That's not fair. God incites to do something, you do it, and then you get punished for it. Wow. That's not nice. So then we read in 1 Chronicles, which is a summary of what happened in the book of Kings and Samuel's, which is one of the newest books we have in the Old Testament, this. A Satan, there's no article now, not the Satan, a Satan, stood up against Israel and incited David to count the people of Israel. Who did it? Was it God or was it Satan? Anyways, this time, Satan is who incites it. Also, a side note, there's no definite article, which is why it should be translated as Satan rather than the Satan or the accuser. Usually when the Hebrew word Satan appears without the article, it refers to human adversaries. In this case, however, it seems to point to a heavenly being that's inciting David. And so we think it's the first time, it's also one of the youngest books, first time that now Satan is a name and not like the accuser or the adversary. It seems like a heavenly being and has a name now. It's also interesting, in the whole book of 1st and 2nd Chronicles, no mentioning of Satan again. Just that one sentence. Because of that, many interpreters assume that by introducing this Satan now into the story, the chronicler wanted to ease the tension in relationship between David and Yahweh, or Yahweh. In other words, it was no longer Yahweh himself who pushed David toward the census, but a Satan who incited him to carry it out. But yeah, only once mentioned, and after that, no mentioning of Satan again. And that's all we have in the Old Testament when it comes to Satan or the devil. When you read the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which is the Septuaginta, that's one of the most complete versions of the Old Testament we have until we found the Qumran texts. But there it says, there they use the word diabolos for this kind of thing. But only also in those 3 passages. No, I'm sorry, they don't use diabolos, they use the Greek word satanas, which is referring to Satan. Yeah, satanas. Diabolos is only New Testament. So what can we say based on these observations about the figure or the concept of Satan in the Old Testament? First of all, there's no single unified description of who or what Satan is in the Old Testament. The picture is not consistent. As we said in Job and Zechariah, however, we do see something in common. Satan appears as a part of the sons of God, meaning he belongs to the heavenly court of Yahweh. He's not outside of God's realm, but part of the divine council. Very important. And in both passages, Satan also has a clear role. He functions in a way that relieves or distances Yahweh from direct responsibility. Satan represents, so to speak, the negative voice, while Yahweh's positive character is emphasized. And Satan remains within the traditional mindset of you get what you deserve, the idea that actions automatically lead to consequences, or better, we say now, punishments. And Yahweh, however, breaks open that rigid system. And it's probably really better to use punishment because, as you know, if you don't use your seatbelt and you make an accident and you fly through the window shield, that's sort of the consequence of not putting on a seatbelt. But to say that God is punishing you for sinning, not using your seatbelt, that's what that means, this act-consequence nexus. There's no punishment, as you learn from Jesus and through Job. So, and also, in the book of Job specifically, it becomes clear that in the Old Testament, suffering and disaster are still repeatedly traced back to God, not to the devil or anything like that. Because God can send plagues, as in Exodus. God can harden the heart of the Pharaoh, right? God can allow illness. God can even send an evil spirit upon Saul in 1 Samuel 16. And there's also some references on your handout about where evilness is connected to God in the Bible. And on earth, the figure of Satan can also serve another purpose, to ease the tension between Yahweh and David. And in the story of David's census, Satan is introduced for theological reasons. To put it very simply, because people struggle probably with the idea that God himself would have incited an action that led to such destruction. So we can say in Judaism, Satan is not understood fully, at least, as a personified being or an own bad God, opponent of God, and certainly not as the embodiment of absolute evil. Rather, it's like good and evil are seen as two sides of a larger reality that ultimately belongs to God's creation. But God, as the eternal being, stands beyond this world. And there's one more thing, because nowhere in the Old Testament does Satan appear as power equal to Yahweh, and we have another Bible passage that really blows our mind if we read it carefully, is Isaiah 45. And there it says, I am the Lord, and there is no other. Besides me, there is no God. I arm you, though you do not know me, so that they may know from the rising of the sun and from the west that there is no one besides me. So far, so good. Then, I am the Lord, and there is no other. I form light, and I create darkness. I make weal, and I create woe. I, the Lord, do all those things. In some translations, it says, I make good, and I make evil. I, the Lord, do all those things. So where is place for the devil in this? As a power, right? All right, that was the introduction to the Old Testament. A lot to take in. Any questions so far or comments? Yeah, can we give you a microphone, Laurie, please? And we can go to the camera, Dale, I think.
So everything you've said.
Oh, wait a minute. Is it not on? Let me check. Oh, yeah, Mary Jane knows how that works.
Everything you've said so far
Yeah.
suggests that there is something, someone, some behavior, some action by Satan, or some presence.
No, it's not some presence. It's a child of God, technically, when you talk about those three passages we're talking about.
Okay,
Which is not a name, right?
but
So-
everything was permitted.
Yes.
Why?
I mean,
Why all the? Why was it allowed? Why permitted?
so there's a different way of answering that question. I will go with the historical answer to that, or historical theological answer. That would be that as we established on the inerrancy of the Bible topic, we believe that the writers of the Bible, besides the Holy Spirit leading them, have also intentions in what they write. It's not invented, but this story of Job is pretty sure not a historical story, but it's telling something about a theological issue that was up. Because the issue was, people said, oh, you sinned, God is punishing you, or your family member, or generations back, right? And Job was written to say, no, that's not the case. But who could this accuser be? The accuser could be us, actually, saying, why is Carol so blessed? Why is Carol rich? Why is Carol so happy all the time? Why is Carol never sick? I mean, it's not true, right? But no wonder she's going to church and blesses the Lord, because nothing happens to her, right? And so that story is actually, the accuser is using our voice we might have as well when we look at people who are blessed. And so the story is telling us, no, there is no connection between that. There are people who are good people and suffer, there are bad people who don't suffer. There's no connection in the theological sense that God is punishing someone. So the accuser, which is just not a name again, it's one of the people at God's court that just asks the question and then thus is allowed to do things. right? But it's not in the literal sense that that person goes around and does those kind of things. It's a metaphor to show that there's no connection between God and punishing people for what they did. But important is, and that's what you realized is, what they want to make clear is that God is sovereign and God has all power. There's nobody above him. There's nothing in this world that can get more power or is equal like God. That's a very important distinction because, and that leads us to another answer I didn't want to give too early, but you asked the question, is when was this written? We know pretty precisely that the book of Job was written during or after they were in Babylonian exile, where, let's go to the slide real quick, Dale. Yeah, so there is, in Babylonian exile, Israel encountered a Persian religion, especially Zoroastrianism, or however you pronounce this in English. You see it down there. That's what and this religion taught a dualistic worldview. And they were not exposed to this before, but now they are. And so suddenly imagine you get abducted into a different culture and a different religion you have never heard of before, and you get introduced to a dualistic worldview. And there is a God of light. I want to show you that God of light. Yes, so this is the God of light, Ahura Mazda. That's where the car Mazda comes from, by the way. No joke. The car Mazda. Yeah, Mazda is how you pronounce it correctly, just saying. It's because it's Hebrew. Or no, Persian. But a God of light, Ahura Mazda. And then there is an opposing God of darkness. And the difference is that this light God has its own kingdom, is its own force and power, and the dark God of darkness has its own kingdom, its own throne room, its own courtroom, whatever you want to call it, and its own power. And so those powers, as I said, and until today this religion has some people that still go this way, says that they will, over hundreds of years, light and darkness is fighting. And one day there might be a Messiah, they have also the Messiah idea, that this light will prevail, okay? And so now imagine you with your religion, and they didn't have a Bible, they only did Torah at that time. You are now confronted with the idea there is a bad God and a good one. What do you do with this? You have to take a statement, or you have to take a stand. And how do we see those things, right? And so the decision they made is to say we take this evil idea and move it into our sovereign God, as you heard in Isaiah, who is in charge of everything. And that means this little bad God, or whatever that's, or this bad version, evil, whatever it is, darkness has no power. It has not its own kingdom. It is part of this one circle, this one throne room, and can only be in this area. It's part of this world by this God. It's never on the same level. Yes?
Well, so maybe I shouldn't say anything about the New Testament yet. That's coming up.
That's coming up, and that's different. It's changing there, but it's still, when we look closely, the same idea.
Paul writes that you're going to have trouble with the world and the flesh and the devil.
Yeah.
But that's not your main problem. Your main problem is the forces of evil and the principalities of darkness in the unseen world.
Yeah.
Is there reason to believe there is an unseen world? Is that a place? Is that a thing?
I mean, that's a very different...
Are there forces of evil there?
Depends on how you ask it. I would say yes, and it depends on a different way I say no.
Okay.
It really depends on what you mean by this. The thing is, the problem is, and that's what we're trying to figure out right now, is that over the time of church and theology and years and decades of different cultures coming together. You know, Christianity is not just American, right? So it's everywhere. It's in Asia, it's in Africa, it's everywhere. We came up with our own ideas what those things mean when we read them in the Bible. And imagine you read King James, Satan shows up all the time in the Old Testament, but actually not as you think it is. As I just tried to explain. And that we cannot sometimes read the Bible without our own experiences, what we learned, what the unseen world is or is not. And that makes it complicated to answer a question like that with yes or no. Because I don't know what you understand on the unseen world. Because we have to figure out what did Paul really mean by that, and what could it mean today? And that's the hard part to figure out, yeah. So I'm really trying to, not to give you an exact answer to those things, it's more, I'm trying to show you these are the biblical facts, what we can learn from it, and it still might give us trouble, right? It can still say, okay, but why is this accuser thing even still allowed to do something? Like why, right? But that was not the question they asked. Because for them it was clear, evil is there. People experience it, and someone has to be somehow responsible for it. But for them it was solace, it was comfort to know that it's all in the framework and permission of God. Today we see this here as problematic, that it's all permitted by God, right? Makes it a bit more complicated. And that's why in the New Testament it gets a twist. Yeah.
So the Satan or a Satan is more like a role than like someone is acting in the role of the Satan or the antagonizer in a particular instance.
Yes. In the Old Testament.
In the Old Testament.
Yeah.
It's not, they're not assigning it, like anybody in a room could be the Satan at that moment.
Yeah. So
just depending on if you ask if you're the one asking the questions or being like, oh, well, what about, then in that case you could be that same adversary or Satan in that instance.
In the Old Testament thinking, that most of you chose Hitler would be pretty accurate, right? There's a person who produces evil, looks evil, does all the evil things, is an adversary to life. You can call that the Satan. Not as a title, not as a name, as what he's doing, as a role, as an accuser, yeah. And I think this is also why it's so interesting that we have like 20 passages where Satan shows up in the Bible and it's not translated as a name or title, because when we think of devil or Satan, for us it's a name. It's automatically connected to sort of an evil god-ish or an evil demon or something like that acts and works, right? And the Old Testament doesn't do that. Because we don't have another word, we don't use Satan in our daily language as, I mean, maybe some of you do, when someone drives weirdly and you say, oh, little Satan, I don't know. But normally we don't, right? But imagine we would use, instead of talking about Satan suddenly in our normal language and say just, oh, the troublemaker is here. And suddenly everybody can become the troublemaker, right? Yeah, we do say that, yeah. Mary Jane.
One of the things that I think of in a discussion like this is something that I have learned for many years as a dog trainer. And that is, for everything that you teach, there's one side and another side. So whenever I train my dog to do a specific task, my dog is also going to learn something that I never intended him to learn, just because there are two sides to every issue. And I look at this in a similar way. It's like looking in the mirror darkly. We see only one side, one vision. We have to be on the other side in order to see that there is a whole lot more than we have in our dimensional experience. And so for me, it's not just an advocate, an adversary. It's the other side of the equation. For everything that I do on this side, I have to be prepared for what will happen on the other side.
Oh.
But that's implying that God is a zero-sum game, right? Like there has to be, like, right, that's like the prosperity gospel, right? You do good, you get good. You do bad, you get bad. But
There is no zero
There's
sum.
like-
Yes, there is no zero sum. Yeah.
right, but implying that there's an equal and opposite, like because there is a God, there must be a devil, is implying that for balance there has to be that opposite.
Yeah. So
Because you can't, that's like those restrooms, right? Like there's a good and therefore there must be a bad. But before that point, they didn't have, Israel didn't have, Jewish people didn't have that good and evil concept exactly.
yeah, so there was no dualism. That's
Right.
the point. And that's very important. There was no dualism for the Jewish or Judaism. But there was definitely God that makes a distinction between light and darkness, right? And water and land and all of that kind of stuff. And so day and night. So that's important because it's part of life, death and life, right? That does belong together, but it's all under one God. There's no. That's called monism, not monotheism. That means one God. But monism also means there's not an extra entity doing something else or so. And that's Isaiah. It's pretty clear. Also spoke into the Babylonian exile is saying, "I'm the Lord. I do both. I'm responsible for darkness and I create light. I'm also do good and I do evil." And it's a very hard thing to wrestle with. Because Martin Luther one time said, I don't know why we quote all this Luther guy, but he said one time, one of his prayers, like upcoming prayers, was also, God, learn me how to live with your dark side. Learn me how to live with the things I don't see and understand of you. Because he knew that at the end, it's all in God's hands. Yeah. And we, for a good reason, probably in our mind, and especially in our new modern thinking, in the liberal church we can maybe judge them a bit more, because we tend to, oh, God is just loving, God is so embracing, God is such forgiving, and so all the dark side stuff has to be this devil thing, or whatever that is, and everything else is on this side, right? But in the Jewish thinking, it's all somehow in God. That's hard to grasp, yeah. Or leave it on, yeah, leave it on. Don't switch it off.
So we have evil in us because we choose to do things we know we shouldn't do sometimes. And God made us in his likeness, so it makes sense that God also has control of the evil.
Okay.
And so we could end up being the adversary.
Yeah.
Because remember how Peter said to Christ, he said, no, you're not going to die on the cross. No, this isn't going to happen.
Yeah.
And Christ says, get behind me.
Satan.
Yeah. And so.
Exactly. And we're going to go into this now because
Okay.
that's important to the dimension that Jesus puts up for Satan. Yeah.
And also, and I'm sure you're going to talk about it, he overcomes the evil that's in the human.
Yes.
In the 40 days he's in the desert.
Yeah.
He overcomes that evil, so he has no evil.
Yes.
He's defeated it when he comes out of the desert.
Yeah. And so you already make the equation that evil is Satan, right?
No, evil is us.
Okay. Okay.
We all have evil.
Yeah.
Man has evil built in.
Yeah.
And if you want to think of it that way, anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. Josie, you have something? Okay. And then we have to keep going before.
I think part of it is that it brings people a lot of comfort to believe that there is good or evil rather than both at the same time. Like going back to Hitler, He was a pretty decent artist before he went into politics. There could have been a decent amount of good and additions to culture put out there if he went down a different path.
Yeah.
So there's good and evil in everybody, and I think it brings a lot of people comfort in thinking that that's not true. They are either good or they're bad, and they like to choose to be good.
Yeah, yeah. That's a good point, yeah. And it's a paradoxon when we talk about God, right? It's just hard to grasp what that means for God when there's sort of a dark side included somehow. But yeah, let's check into the New Testament and maybe we get some more ideas here. So important now, I have to repeat this, in the Old Testament, Satan, even as he becomes sort of a name and title in one of the youngest books in 1 Chronicles, is clearly restrained. Satan is limited, operates within God's authority. But in writings surrounding the Hebrew Bible, we found out, especially in movements we call the Jewish apocalyptic literature, Qumran is one of those. And we showed you this little cave on Monday 2 weeks ago where they found that, right? Those scripture rolls. And then there was a big library in Nineveh where over 80,000 volumes they discovered, which they didn't discover before Martin Luther. It was discovered in 1857, if I'm correctly, where they found 80,000 books around the world of the Orient and stuff like that, which helped us to understand what the biblical world was like. So that's like all of this kind of narrow and precise work that helps us to understand the environment that was written in. And so we found things that in a movement we call the Jewish apocalyptic literature, something suddenly begins to change from the last time we heard about Satan in the 1 Chronicles. There, Satan as a name, as a figure, becomes increasingly powerful. And the more powerful Satan becomes in their writings and thinking, the more people on earth are suddenly seen as serving Satan. And by the time of Jesus, some apocalyptic groups were saying things like, the Romans have their own empire, they're the biggest empire at that time. Remember, dualism starts to creep into them and still. And so Romans were seen as servants of Satan. Why? Because Satan now, in the thinking they had, developed, rules the world. And then the greatest empire of the world, the Roman Empire, must belong to Satan. And this is where titles like the ruler of this world begin to gain political meaning. And it shows up in the Gospel of John, for example. And there's still a lot of people thinking that way today. But what happens when theology becomes dualistic, when we think that way, that we have those two sort of entities? The world has to be divided into, we are the good community. Where are we right now? We are the good community, the world is evil, unbelievers become servants of Satan. Ever heard of this? It's not in the Bible. That somehow happens. And then the first consequence is you cannot make compromises with the servants of Satan. Political cooperation becomes impossible, cooperation. Dialogue becomes a betrayal, and the world is evil, so engagement feels wrong. And then the second consequence of this thinking is loving your neighbor is taking a vacation. Because loving your neighbor begins to disappear. If someone is labeled as servant of Satan, why love them? You can't love Satan, so why love those supposedly controlled by him? And this is where it gets harmful and bad theology is. You can already hear this logic today in the way some groups speak about atheists or Muslims or about Christians who are considered too liberal. People are demonized long before they even have an encounter with them. And then, that's now where the quote comes in, Dale. And once fear enters the picture, love becomes impossible. That's why it ends up dangerous to think that way. Because people you fear deeply are the people you struggle to love. So we have to pray for our enemies, not because we have to be afraid of them, but we have to love them. And systems that produce fear, even religious systems, always come at the expense of love. So evil in a biblical sense is not simply bad people. Evil is whatever blocks love. So dualism multiplies fear, and fear leads to separation. And then, when we look into the New Testament, something feels still different, because suddenly Satan appears much more frequently. The language becomes stronger. We hear about temptation, demons, spiritual struggle, and even titles like the ruler of this world. And so the question then arises, did the Bible change its mind? Or in this, the more helpful question might be, what changed in the world, in history, and in human experience with God and spirituality that caused believers to speak about evil suddenly differently? So, let's do some biblical fact-checking. Names or descriptions for the devil in the New Testament. There's a little bit more variety now. It's not entirely clear who or what exactly the devil or Satan is, though. But let's look at some specific terms. And you have them all on your handout. There are two main terms. The first is Satanas, Satan, whose Hebrew background we already explained. And then the term appears 36 times in 33 verses. And diabolos appears 37 times in 35 verses. Remember, the Old Testament is like 2/3 of the Bible. New Testament is 1/3 of the Bible. We had a personification of Satan 3 times in the Old Testament. And then we have now, do the math, yeah, 74? 73? You're right, 73. Times in the New Testament. So there's a little bit of a change. But both terms are, as you see, mostly equally often used. And an interesting detail is, I don't know if that helps, but it's an interesting detail. The Gospel of Mark and the 7 undisputed letters of Paul, there's some we're not sure if it's Paul's students that wrote them or Paul himself, but the 7 letters that are definitely from Paul, and they use only the Greek word Satanas. There's no diabolos, there's only Satanas that shows up. And in the other letters, only the word diabolos shows up. And the 3 other Gospels, the book of Acts and the book of Revelation, they use both terms. And however there is no clear difference in the meaning between devil and Satan in the New Testament, they seem to refer to the same reality. It's also interesting that only a few New Testament writings make no mention at all of satanic figures. It's Galatians, Philippians, Colossians, and the 2 Peter letter. No mentioning. I put them all on the handout. And then the New Testament also contains a number of broader descriptions of, let's say, evil. They are also summarized at the last part of the handout, where different names are used for the devil or evil in the world. You don't go through them all together now, it's a little bit too much work. So the question now is, what is the function or role of the devil or Satan in the New Testament? When we look at the passages. We don't really know. It's hard to tell. There's not really a consistent picture of Satan or the devil because the New Testament uses many different terms and descriptions. If we can speak of a general theme at all, it is probably this. In the New Testament, the devil often appears as God's opponent, someone who tries to hinder or disrupt God's work wherever possible. On the one hand, Satan prevents people from doing certain things, as we see in this Bible verse from Thessalonians. For we wanted to come to you, certainly, I, Paul, wanted to again and again, but Satan blocked our way. So Satan is hindering or preventing people from doing certain things. He is described as a power that threatens human salvation and tries to pull people away from faith. That's, for example, in Luke or in 2 Corinthians. But at the same time, Satan can also act paradoxically in a way that ultimately serves God's purposes and even benefits people. And that is in 2 Corinthians 12, where Paul writes, "Therefore, to keep me from being too elated, a thorn was given in my flesh, and a messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from being too elated." As if something bad happens to him, but it's seen as good, because it's preventing him from being too elated. So here's something connected to Satan that actually serves to keep Paul humble. So there's a tension. On one hand, Satan appears within God's sphere of authority, almost like an official carrying out a task. That's a little bit like Zechariah or Job, or in Revelation 12, the same thing. On the other hand, he's described as an independent ruler, for example, as the ruler of this world, which is in the Gospel of John mainly the case. Or as the God of this age is also a term for him, or she, or whatever that is. This shows how complex and multifaceted the New Testament picture of the devil really is. And then the enemies of Satan, they are clearly named in the New Testament as well. It's God, 2 Corinthians, it's Jesus, the archangel, and then the disciples, or the believers. They're all the enemy of the Satan. And then we have something that happens in Revelation 12. Satan is identified with an old dragon, or also called the ancient serpent, which could be a New Testament interpretation of the serpent in Genesis. But we have to be careful because it's over 1,000 years later that the Revelation was written, and suddenly they make a connection to the old serpent in Genesis. Could also just mean, devil, your old serpent, like an insult, like that old dragon, it's like that serpent, who knows. And then, when Jesus names something a devil, he always identifies the devil with people. For example, in John, he says, "Did I not choose you, the 12? Yet one of you is a devil." Is a devil. Interesting. So the devil gets identified with Judas, right? And even crazier than that's what Virgil mentioned in Mark 8. Jesus calls Peter Satan when he says, "Satan, go behind me," because he wants to hinder Jesus from taking the path of suffering to the cross. What is the devil doing in the New Testament? A biblical scholar once wrote, "Whenever a path towards salvation is drawn, there must be a negative force from which the path moves away." It's a little bit what you guys were talking about. In other words, if Christ brings healing, then something opposes healing. If Christ brings freedom, something enslaves. If Christ brings truth, something deceives. So Satan in the New Testament often represents that opposing force. One of the central convictions of the New Testament is that through Christ's death and resurrection, sin is defeated, death is defeated, evil has no power. 1 Corinthians 15 says the final enemy to be destroyed is death. And the only time that Jesus speaks of heavenly Satan figure, he does that once. He speaks of a figure, Satan, and that's in Luke 10, where he says, "I watched Satan fall from heaven like a flash of lightning." Seems like there's not much to do for the Satan anymore, huh? It's fallen down, destroyed. So whatever Satan represents, accusation, deception, resistance, destructive power, it is still not ultimate. It is not eternal. It is still not equal to God. It just falls from the heaven. And that is again in line with the analysis of the Job passage. That's why I'm saying before that Job gives us the framework even for the New Testament when it gets a little bit more intense with the devil. So what do we do with this? That's probably the question. First thing is, we acknowledge a reality. Evil is real. And it doesn't matter if you believe in a personal devil that acts like sort of independently or dependent on God. We all know what Virgil said. People do harm. Systems oppress. We sabotage ourselves and others. We sometimes do what we don't want to do and still do it. Paul says that painfully, right? He says, "For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do." By the way, he takes responsibility. Sometimes I hear Christians say, and I heard that also in Methodist churches, "Sorry, the devil made me, the devil hindered me, the devil blocked me, blah, blah, blah." I'm like, take responsibility and don't give it to the devil. Call it sin, call it brokenness, call it the satanic impulse, call it destructive freedom. But we cannot deny evil is real, whatever name we gave it. But the second thing is, and that is important, God is not threatened. The devil, however we understand it, is never God's equal. There's no cosmic arm wrestling match where we are not sure who will win. God remains sovereign always. There's no doubt about this in the Bible. So what might giving up the devil mean? Maybe for us, giving up the devil doesn't mean pretending evil doesn't exist, but maybe it means giving up a dualistic worldview we might inherit from Christian tradition that left the biblical facts a bit. It might be giving up this medieval cartoon villain who sits there. Have you read the C.S. Lewis one, Devil's, what's that called in English? Yeah, have you read that? Yes. Yeah, I like it. It's actually very entertaining. But don't think that there is a devil up there like, how can I bother Lori today? And how can I, it's actually showing us that there is a little devil inside of us. That when we don't pay attention to the good and to what God calls us to do, we tend to do the work of the devil. We can use that metaphor. But I would say be careful how you use it. I feel like it's more accurate to say if I follow my bad instincts or the satanic in me, I don't know. Yeah, let's give up this cartoon villain. And let's give up the idea that we can blame an external being for everything. And maybe it means recognizing the accuser can live inside of us. That voice that says, "You are not enough." They will never change. Don't forgive. They don't deserve it. Protect yourself. Maybe the Satan is sometimes that inner adversary. And maybe Christ's work is not about scaring us with this hell imagery, but freeing us from accusation, freeing us from fear, freeing us from destructive patterns. So when you think back to the original image you had when you came in, has it changed? Is this devil still an evil God version? Or is it something more subtle maybe? Not less dangerous maybe, but just more subtle. More theological, more interior, more systemic, more connected to accusation and broken systems. If the biblical picture itself develops and evolves as we just saw from the Old Testament to New Testament, maybe our understanding must also grow. And maybe giving up the devil means giving up simplistic images and taking responsibility for how we participate in evil ourselves. And if you just need another thought about the power of the devil, what about Matthew 28? That's a very interesting one. Jesus came and said to them, "All power in heaven and earth." By the way, that's only the resurrected Jesus that can say that. It's not in the Sermon on the Mount. "All power in heaven and on earth has been given to me." Let me ask you, how much power is left for the devil? All right. Thank you for listening so long and still in the time frame. Do you have any final questions? I skipped the discussion part because we had a big discussion.
Maybe that's
Yeah, give 1 second.
1 second.
Could you, a summary of what are the bad theology part
Yeah,
of the devil?
yeah.
Do you have in your own mind a summary of where's the bad theology part in the whole idea of the devil?
It's the bad theology part, or the harmful part, is when we think like this. That there are two powers up there. One is, and both are trying to get our attention in an active way. I feel like this is not the case. It's not really biblical fitting. And the same thing is with Satan meeting Jesus in the desert, right? If we mirror this with the Genesis story, then we can actually think that way, that maybe Jesus is wrestling with his own devil. And because it's the questions he could ask himself. Wouldn't my God give me just the kingdom anyways? If I would now jump, and maybe God would actually help me. So it doesn't have to be like a figure that comes down and talks to Jesus. It can be this inner adversary, because the Bible doesn't state it that way. It doesn't say, this is what historically happened. It could just be like, this is what Jesus wrestled with. And we know those experiences too, right? So I feel like don't give the devil more power than he has. No matter if you see him if it helps you to use the devil as a person or the personification of evil, okay, that's fine. But put him in his place. Don't give him power, because he doesn't have power. There's no room for that. But when we think in this dualistic way that he has power, I think that's when it gets harmful. Also, when we assign the devil to groups, to other religions, or to atheists, or to immigrants, or whoever it is, right? That can be used in all kinds of ways. And then we cannot love that person anymore because we are in fear and think we have to protect ourselves from the satanic people. Yeah. And that's where it gets harmful, I would say. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think so. I don't mean to sound harsh,
Yeah.
okay? But I have thought of the Ayatollah
Yeah,
as an evil man.
yeah, sure.
He thinks of me as an evil man.
Probably, or maybe not, who knows, yeah.
You know, if he knew me,
Yeah,
he would say, I'm an evil man. And so
yeah.
I simply struggle with the idea that there's a force, an energy, a behavior, an effort of evil that infiltrates human beings. And it's just, for me, it's a very curious thing. The stuff that people do,
Yeah, totally.
that is just evil,
Yeah,
and it's hard to understand.
yeah. And I think...
And you better not even see it that way. You better not know it,
Yeah.
you know.
No, you're right, and I hope that was clear that that's the first thing we have to acknowledge. What the Bible does acknowledge is evil exists, and evil is bad. And what the Bible also tells us is we can become part of it. And I wouldn't say, but I would make the difference between, it's not someone sitting there and saying, here's some candy if you join me in hating Laurie. Like, that's how it sometimes comes across to me. Yeah. What kind of candy? Okay. Yeah, that might be the difference, right? Some Bavarian pretzels. Who knows? I would do something for that. But that's, I think, we have to make a distinction first of all. And then what does the Bible say is the, if the Bible could talk, what can we find in the Bible is the root of all evil? Exactly. The love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. There's the answer. I feel like there's the answer. If we worship, and that's what Jesus was very clear about, right? The mammon, right? The other god. Don't follow this one. And so I feel like by using this too much, we actually keep the actual danger away from us, which is worshiping money. Because when we look at Ayatollah, when we look at what the government is doing, what other governments are doing, it's all about money. At the end of the day, it's all about money. When do family break apart? When it's about inheritance, right? It's all about money. Yeah. Yeah, Dale has a question or a closing statement.
The sort of the notion that Satan is behind evil. Jesus is presented with a scenario where somebody is crushed when a tower falls on them.
Yeah.
And his response is, well, they weren't any more evil than anyone else. I mean, it wasn't a consequence of something that person did. Yeah. And I'm, Lori's first question raises the whole, not at all easy to answer problem of pain or the problem of evil. And I think what we're all looking for is, who can I blame? And I think about the disease that I've been diagnosed with, which starts with the word idiopathic, which I've sometimes interpreted to mean that as doctors, they're too idiotic to know what actually caused it. but that's what it means. We don't know why this illness has befallen you. There is not a direct cause. But then part of the blaming thing means then that I might not do, because if I'm just blaming the devil and there's nothing, if I get, what's the word I'm looking for? If I get to where, I can't think of the word, but there's nothing I can do about it. It's fatalistic. Yeah, which is appropriate when you're talking about a fatal illness. If I'm fatalistic, then I don't do the things that I could do that will make the course of this thing better, like walking and things of that, exercising, things of that sort. There are things that I can do, but if I'm too busy blaming, it was the fault of this or the fault of that, then I don't either have to do those things or anyway. That's what I'm saying is that if we blame the devil, then we don't take responsibility and do the things we can do to put that evil out of our lives.
But also one last thought about this is the Bible is very smart. It doesn't say where the evil comes from. Because they don't go into this area.
I want to know that.
Yeah, they don't go into this area. They don't go into this area. They try to give us some comfort in saying it doesn't matter because all power is with Jesus. Right? It's idiopathic. It's idiopathic, yeah. But even when you think about the Genesis, a beautiful, awesome story about this kind of how humans think and work with this talking snake suddenly. But it's a beautiful way because it doesn't tell us where those thoughts that Eve suddenly has, where this comes from. It's not explained, it's just there. It's part of the world. And we have to make a decision, I would say. Do we go with Jesus or do we listen to those voices? We can call it the devil, we can call it the inner adversary, who is the evil. Yeah. Right. All right, friends, I want to value your time. Thank you very much for coming out. I saw some tired faces, but I hope you still took something home. On Sunday, we're going to look at 2 more Bible passages, which I will try to explain a bit better. And Let's close with our evening song we learned the last two Mondays, and then send you home. Do you play Cole, or? Do you want to sing, or? Okay, yeah. Me neither.
We'll figure it out.
The day thou gavest, Lord, is ended. Darkness falls at thy behest. With thee a morning hymns ascended. Thy praise shall hallow the world. We thank thee, O thy church is sleeping, while earth owes all thee to love. So be it now, thy throne shall never like earth, proud empires pass away. Thy kingdom stands and grows forever, till all thy creatures own thy sway. Let us pray. Loving God, we want to thank you for this evening. We want to thank you for all the things we learned. And we want to thank you that you are above all. We want to thank you for the word of Jesus that he said all power on earth and in heaven is with Jesus. Help us to follow Jesus more in our lives. Help us to avoid evil, to not partake and participate in evil, and help us to be voices of truth against injustice in this world. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So friends, a little update what's happening. On Sunday we'll have the sermon on giving up the devil. And then next Monday we're talking about giving up the concept of hell. Whatever that means. And Henning will lead us in that one, so that will be another challenging evening, I think. And we'll look at this closer what that means. All right. Good night.